as an economist, I now want to try taking some cases and showing you how economic analysis can help you understand what's just and what isn't, help you understand, not provide a definitive verdict. And I'm going to do this by just taking some problems. My goal here is to show you both how economic thinking can help you understand what's just and how what's just helps you do better economic thinking. There's a kind of simple examples, all intended to illustrate a contemporary problem, which is compensation for what we call regulatory takings. Big controversy in the United States today, as you know. The government is imposing all kinds of restrictions in the name of environmentalism or land use controls or other things on property, and do people deserve compensation and all of that. The court cases are very mixed up and so on. Okay, we got this situation we begin with, and I've got 6 different situations here, but we begin with Harry. Can everybody see Harry up there? Get down here like this. Harry owns 5 acres at the intersection of highways 49 and 38, and I just made those highway numbers up, in which he operates a successful motel and restaurant. Okay, then the state builds a bypass, which goes quite around that, and Harry's business is cut in half. Does the state owe Harry compensation? I hear some yeses and I see some heads shaking. Well, I am not going to resolve any of these. I'm just going to make some comments. What? They didn't take any of his land, yeah. But they sure did Harry down, didn't they? I mean, is Harry mad about that? Yeah, Harry feels he got a rum deal. Well, okay, you know, but there are a lot of bad things that could happen. You can say, well, those are ordinary business risks. Constitution doesn't protect you against ordinary business risks. On the other hand, when the state does something that does you down, you feel a kind of special grievance, don't you? I mean, the state built that highway there, and they could have built that highway differently. So let me move on. Let me ask this one. The state builds a superhighway with an exit at 49 and 38, and Harry's business doubles. Does Harry owe compensation to the state? Well, you know, an interesting thing here. Harry does pay some compensation to the state. In what form? Taxes, right. Now, what does that do? Does that settle anything? No, but it calls your attention to something. Now you remember back when Harry got screwed in the first case here, Harry's taxes went down too. So he did get some form of compensation, didn't he? But now we can say, well, you know, it's what is important. Suppose that Harry discovers, after going back to number 1, suppose that Harry discovers that they were going to do it this way, but in fact they did it this way because the nephew of somebody on the county council owns a, now what does Harry feel? Unfair, right? It is important that these government is going to be constantly engaging in actions that make some people better off and some people worse off. When the government, for example, in the 1950s decided in response to Sputnik to subsidize research and college education, it did a wonderful thing for me. I was just starting my college teaching career in the year of Sputnik, and the government made me much richer. The important thing is not that I compensate the taxpayer for all of this. The important thing is that other people believe that the process is fair. And I mention this because right now in my state, and in many other states too, taxpayers are getting a little upset about the amount of money going to college education, going into research, into projects of dubious value. And they're cutting back on budgets. And I just got a memo saying the university wants you to write your congressman and make sure that there's no more cutting of university-bound expenditures. And I'm refusing to do it because I think my university gets too much money already. And that if the taxpayers knew how we spent it, they would cut it even further. But I'm guided here by a notion of fundamental fairness. Okay, and you say, well, what is fair? Well, that's complicated, but let me go on. I don't want to talk about that, about the college. I want to go back to Harry. The state condemns Harry's property and builds a superhighway where his motel and restaurant formerly stood. Does the state owe Harry compensation? Yeah, the law is very clear here. But you know, you think about these three cases. Why when you run the highway right through Harry's motel, you give him 100% compensation, but when you run it around somewhere else and you really deprive him of the profitable use of his property, you don't owe him anything. So we want to be thinking about these things and recognizing that the procedures we use have to be regarded as fair. All right, we have developed the rule, the court has affirmed the rule, that when the government takes 100% of the value, it owes you compensation. And maybe if it takes 90%, it owes you compensation. But if it takes 80%, maybe it doesn't owe you any compensation at all. Now, I submit to you that that's not a good rule. That when we think about the rule and its application, it strikes us as unfair. And therefore, that's a rule that we probably want to change. The Lucas case. Lucas was a guy in South Carolina who bought land on a barrier island. And after he bought the land, paying, I think, something like $1 million for these 2 lots, after he bought the land, the state of South Carolina decided there was too much building on these lands, on these barrier islands, and so it denied him permission to build. Now, he had bought that land under rules of the game that said he could build out there. After he had bought the land and paid $1 million for it, the state said, you can't build there. Is that fair? I think not. That's really changing the rules in the middle of the game. I would argue that the state owes Lucas compensation. The Supreme Court of the United States agreed, but their reasoning wasn't very persuasive. They said, well, they deprived him of all use of the property. To which I would want to raise the question, but what if they deprived him of only 80% of it? Suppose they said, well, you can put a tent up there on the weekends, but you can't build a condominium. I think we're going to have to get a little clearer because we've got to make the rules of the game fair. All right, proceeding on. To do that, I'll have to grab another transparency here. Okay, Harry's still got this restaurant motel. State discovers that an endangered species is nesting on Harry's property and orders him to close down his motel and restaurant to avoid interference with his nesting routines. Does the state owe Harry compensation? Yeah, this is a troubling one right now. The Constitution says the state may not, federal government and state governments now, it's applied to the states of the 14th Amendment, may not take private property for public use except on payment of just compensation. And we are all interested, if we are interested, in preserving endangered species, so why should we put the whole burden on Harry? And I think Harry has a legitimate complaint. We're changing the rules of the game. Notice something else. If we don't do this, if we don't change the rules of the game, if we aren't fair to Harry, we're signaling to every property owner, don't let an endangered species on your land. Rick, where are you? Yeah, Mike Copeland case. Have you talked about that to anybody? Yeah. Well, I mean, there are ranchers, when they find out that if they provide habitat for deer, they may suddenly discover that they got to go on providing habitat forever. Will immediately get rid of all the habitat. So laws like this destroy hospitality. There are ranchers and farmers in California who patrol their land with shotguns to kill any threatened species that decides to take up residence on their land, because your land can be taken away from you if you're kind to kangaroo rats, for example. Okay, let's try another slightly different case, though. The state discovers that an endangered species is nesting on Harry's property and orders him not to go ahead with a planned expansion of his restaurant and motel. Does the state owe Harry compensation? I think there's a little difference here. There may be a difference. You see, Harry in the first case was operating it, and the state tried to do him down. In the second case, Harry wanted to expand. And you might ask, did Harry buy this land at a price that reflected the possibility of expansion? I think these are relevant questions if we're trying to decide what's fair. Let me move on. The state orders Harry to close his bar and cocktail lounge at 9 o'clock each evening to avoid the loud noises that disturb families living near Harry's place. Does the state owe Harry compensation? Now, this one is different because Harry's now creating a nuisance. Nobody has a right to create a nuisance. But there's another doctrine, which I love. I love the coming to the nuisance. Yeah, coming to the nuisance. You see, in other words, if I'm way out in the country somewhere having loud parties, and you decide, hey, I think I'm going to build a house right next to your loud party, that's a different story, isn't it? So we want to look at the history of this in order to decide whether you may do this or not. And of course, there are all kinds of methods of accommodation. I read a couple of years ago, I tried to run the source down, I couldn't find it. But somebody, I think it was in California, there was some outfit that ran stock car races in a neighborhood, and the neighbors were complaining, and they got the neighborhood to give consent to running these races by giving all the people who lived near the stock car race a ticket to Las Vegas on the night of the race. So, all right.